Our scripture for this morning comes from Ephesians chapter 4, verses 17 through 24. And in this, we're going to be taking a look at this issue of image and likeness, and how that, if it does, relates to the old humanity and the new humanity that we've been talking about. This I say, therefore, and testify in the Lord. You should no longer walk as the rest of the Gentiles walk, in the futility of their perception. Their understanding has been darkened, having been alienated from the life of God by means of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardness of their heart. Having become calloused to their true desires, they gave themselves up to unbridled appetites, covetously laboring for what is unfruitful. But this is not how you learned Christ. Now, isn't that interesting? We're not going to deal with this, but I do want you to think about this. This is how you learned Christ, not about Christ, but learning the person Jesus himself, right? If indeed you have heard him and have been taught in him, because the truth is in Jesus. In regard to your former way of life, you were taught to put away the old humanity, which continually perishes through deceived desires, and to be continually renewed by the Spirit in your perception, putting on the new humanity, which, conforming to God, was created in righteousness and holiness, rooted in the truth. All right, here's where we are so far in the past two messages leading us up to this morning. Jesus is the image and likeness of God. Humanity is created in Jesus so that we might bear the image and likeness of God that he is. Image refers to the kind of being we are, which is to say, our nature. Nature answers the question, what is it? If we ask, what is humanity? Scripture replies, we are the image of God. Our image, our nature is static. It does not change. Likeness refers to how our kind of being functions, acts, lives, given our nature, which is image of God. Likeness answers the question, what does it do? If we ask the question, what is the function of humanity? Scripture replies, to grow in likeness to God through communion with him. Our function, unlike our nature, is dynamic. It is subject to change. And then finally, human death in Scripture, when it's spoken of in that derogatory way that's problematic, human death in Scripture is the loss of our capacity to function. Just as we say someone is brain dead when there are no longer any function of brain activity. It is the loss of our human way of life, which is to grow in the likeness of God through communion with him. All of that fit together? Okay. So, moving on to the message today, let's look at these verses, 22 to 24. In regard to your former way of life, you were taught to put away the old humanity, which continually perishes through deceived desires, and to be continually renewed by the Spirit in your perception, putting on the new humanity which, conforming to God, was created in righteousness and holiness, rooted in the truth. All right. So our first question here is, in verse 22, what does Paul's term old humanity refer to? Our image or our likeness? One more time, couldn't hear, honest. Likeness. How do you know? Why do you say that?
It's all talking about your function.
It's talking about a function. It's a way of life. Your former way of life, your former functioning. Yes, exactly right. How do verses 17 through 19 support your answer? So go back to those up top. You should no longer what it says in 17. Walk. And what is your walk? How you live. It's your way of life.
And it changes.
And it changes, doesn't it? Absolutely it does. What are some characteristics of this old humanity in these verses? What do you see? Look at 17 through 19, for example, as well as 20 and following.
Flawed perceptions.
Yeah, futility, flawed perception. So think about, we oftentimes think about death as the lack of life, which is appropriate. It's appropriate. So this perception, there's a lack of life in it. It's the inability to perceive. That's why it's futile.
Therefore unable to communicate with God.
Exactly right. Exactly right. The understanding has been what? Darkened. And it's very helpful to remember, Scripture oftentimes pairs light with life and darkness with death, right? Whoever follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. Yeah. With thee is the fountain of life. In thy light shall we see light. Those are things that are put together. So this is speaking about a condition in which there is death. And it's because there's no communion. Look at the next part of that verse. They're alienated from God. That's why their perception. So if you go back, our likeness is the function in which we grow in the likeness of God. How? Through communion with God. Corrupt the communion and you corrupt the function, right? And so it's because there isn't this communion that there can be no true perception and that the understanding becomes darkened. Yeah. And so what we end up with is ignorance inside us, not the truth. And that's because we talked about this when we talked about the heart. It's because our heart gets hardened, meaning it is diseased in some sense. Yeah. And notice 19. How many times have we spoken about this? Having become callous to their true desires. It's because your heart is hard. That hardness means you're callous to what is it that you genuinely long for. Yes?
It's like callous aren't just the heart. You just think of them physiologically. You don't feel with calluses. The reason they build up is you just don't feel things anymore.
Exactly.
So you're not as sensitive to what you want to be.
Exactly right. That loss of sensitivity is a real issue. It means that, for example, we can't be present to the presence of God because we've lost this sense of sensitivity to Him. And what makes this worse for us over and over and over and over and over is that our way of life pushes us in a way, develops us or corrupts our capacity to be sensitive. That's so important. We think that there's no real issue with, well, I know that I should get my value about myself from God, and not from other people. We think, well, it would be the right thing to do. We always like to, it'd be the right thing, as though morality is the issue here. What we don't understand is that the more we continue to callous our hearts by a false way of life, the more we lose sensitivity to the reality that is present with us always, but we are unaware of. And so we want to try and argue, well, that's not really wrong because I could say this and this person is doing this and they're not going to hell, as though that's the issue. What we're talking about here is you've lost a human way of life. That's the problem. You are an image that cannot function by imaging. You are an image. You know, a heart is a pump. Well, what does that heart do? It pumps. Okay. The nature determines the function. Our problem is then, if we have lost that capacity for communion, the more we live apart from it, the more calloused we are to it. And so we live perishing rather than being enlivened. Does this make sense? Okay, so I realize that there is paradox in what I'm about to say. It goes with what we talked about last time in terms of works of death. Well, if you're dead, how can you work, right? But it's a way of life in which there is no life. It's a way of life in which there is no life. And that's why you wonder why, when I'm living like this, I don't feel what I ought to feel. That my life seems to lack the fullness that I long for. And why this never accomplishes the life that genuinely satisfies. It's because there is no life in it. It's simply an acting out of death. That's all it is. All right, any other comments? Or are there any questions in regard to this? All right, let's move into the next question. In verses 23 and 24, what does Paul's term new humanity refer to? Our image or our likeness?
Still likeness.
Still likeness.
Functioning differently now.
Yes, there is now human functioning. It's a new humanity, and the word new here does not mean chronologically new. It's new in the sense of a different kind. A kind that has not yet been seen. It's a different kind of humanity, and so it's new to us.
So not restored from a previous kind, but a unique new kind of itself.
Well,
Like an uncreated humanity?
this goes to part of what we were talking about, I think the first time, might have been last time. We've got to remember point one in our summary. Jesus is the image. And then point two, humanity is created, we could say finally created in Jesus. Remember that the creation of humanity, Adam and Eve, is where humanity begins, but that's not where it's going to end up. So Jesus is where humanity is finally created. Yes, finally there. Okay, the goal I've been working for since Adam, I have achieved it in Jesus. And this is why, well, I'll save that for later. So, does that help answer the question?
It was a bad question. That's, yeah, sorry.
It's all right.
Yeah.
So yes, we're talking here about a likeness. Once again, if our nature is static, Our nature is image of God. When sin enters the picture, we don't get a new nature. We're still the image of God. A brain doesn't turn into something else when it loses its function. It doesn't become a toe. It doesn't have a different nature. It's the same thing as it was. So, as we have talked about, sin doesn't cause a sin nature. No, your nature is still image of God. That's what you are. And that just doesn't change. The problem is that you've lost your function. You've lost your capacity to function. And so it's very interesting that what Paul is doing here is showing humanity when it couldn't function, and now humanity where it does function. There was a way of life that was death because there was no functioning. Now there's a way of life that actually brings humanity to its existence. Now there's a question.
Yeah. So you said nature determines function. So in these terms, our being the image of God should determine the way that we function in the new country.
Yes, and that's why the word likeness is there. If we don't look like God, then we aren't imaging him. And like a heart that is a pump, what does it do? It pumps. That's how you know it's a pump. An image has the function of looking like what it images, right? So how does an image live? By growing in likeness to that which it images. That's your function. That's the way of life a human being has. Not just if you're religious, it's what it means to be human. And so, if we are trying to live in such a way that it's not bringing us closer in likeness to God through communion with him, the only thing we are doing is living out our death. There is no life in that. We're actually trying to contradict our own nature. It's that basic and fundamental. As I want to say, we don't go stick our heads in a bucket of water and then try and take a deep breath. Why? Because our nature is not that we receive our oxygen through the water. We don't have gills. And because that's true, we can't have the function of sucking up water to get our air. It's really that basic.
Can you say that again? If we're trying to live our lives out?
I have no idea.
If we're trying to if we are trying to live out our lives.
Yeah, in a way that doesn't look like God.
Okay. We are living out what?
Death.
That's good.
So the new humanity, the kind of humanity that we see here, is a fully functioning humanity. Right? Of course it is, because we're created in Jesus, whose way of life matched him as an image. All the way through. We're created in him. That's the new humanity. That's the humanity that was always intended, and Adam could never have become that. It was not within his capacity to become that, because humanity is always going to be created in Jesus. Jesus is where
That's the goal.
always,
Yeah.
always, Kara.
That's the image.
Yes. And so Jesus is both the final cause and the efficient cause of all of this, as well as several other causes mixed in. But that's the case. He's the goal, And he's what makes it happen too. Okay. How do verses 17 through 19 connect with your answer? In particular, take a look at 24 and then compare that to verses 17 and following.
Well, one is living a darkened life, right? Like 17 and 18, that's the person that's alienated from God, not communing with God.
Yes.
They're living out they're living life in debt.
Excuse
The
me.
other person is putting on a new kind of humanity, which is Jesus, right? And they're living in righteousness and holiness.
Yeah, and the key phrase is the living in.
Yeah.
What we see in 17 and following are, we could say, characteristics of a life that is neither righteous nor holy.
Unfruitful.
Unfruitful, which means there's no life in it to produce fruit. Right? Yes. So, there's this, I know this is grammar and we all hate grammar, but there's a difference between righteous and righteousness. Grammatically speaking, a person is righteous, but that's demonstrated by their righteousness that they do. So righteousness is how you're acting. And what is it that we're talking about? We're talking all about your manner of life, your way of life. So there is a righteousness, a way of living that matches what your image is. And that's what you see in verse 24. The new humanity which, conforming to God, was created in a way of life that is rooted in the truth. And what does verse 21 tell us? Truth is in Jesus. He's the truth. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. He comes, right? He lives as the image of God, brings humanity into that as the image of God, and lives the function of that image, displaying likeness to God. If you want to know what God looks like, look at me. He who has seen me has seen the Father. I only do what I see the Father doing. Therefore, when you see what I do, it's in the exact likeness of the Father. So his way of life is in concert with the kind of life that he has. And that is what is being brought to us. This is the very problem that we have had since sin entered the picture. We have lost a way of life that is the human way. And there's no way for us to get that quote back. And that was never, in that instance, before Jesus, it was never even possible to have it on our own. We can be accommodated to it in a growing fashion, but we're always reaching out for it and never having it because it's in process. We only see the creation of humanity when we see the incarnation. The incarnation is humanity finally created. Everything else has been prelude to that. Does that make sense? So let's move on. How does this verse from John relate to our new humanity? I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly.
Participating
Right.
in the life of Christ,
Yes.
in his life, brings about abundance. That's what communing with him is the abundant life. It's not about possessions or things or
all of that other
all that
stuff.
other stuff.
By design.
So, what we're saying here is this life that we have, we're so used to thinking about death only in terms of our bodies finally wearing out and then we go into the grave. That's all the way that we know how to think about death. And we talked about originally that there is this union between spirit and physicality. We're not two nails or two boards nailed together so that there's this thing and this thing. We're rather this union of both. If you lose your spiritual capacity to live in communion with God, then what you are as a union has died. You've lost your way of life. There's no functioning of what you are as the union of spirit and flesh. Your flesh isn't evil, right? We talked about all this. And so when he talks about have life abundantly, it's not some kind of new energy in that sense. It's talking about you get to function as a human being now. And it is in that communion with God that you grow in his likeness and your humanity becomes what it was intended to be. This is where your freedom from sin comes. It comes in communion, participating in communion. It's not something you feel first and then it just happens in your life. It's the way in which you live. It is the mode that you carry out your life. This is where your joy comes in. This is where your well-being comes in. It's part and parcel with a way of life. It isn't a set of emotional experiences that because you're just so taken up, you then just go out and do. It is a way of being. It's a way of life that you live, and that is an abundant life. Your function matches what you are. And the reason you're unfulfilled in any degree is because your function is not matching what you are. Always. It's why you can win an argument and walk away saying, gosh, that doesn't feel like what I thought it would. It's because the point is not to win the silly argument. The point is to display likeness of God with the person that is arguing with you. That's what you're made for.
So if you're unfilled, it's because you're not functioning in the way you were created in the new
Correct.
humanity.
Correct.
Right?
Yep.
And then a lot of times, or oftentimes, most cases, it's our perception that is deceived.
Correct. Correct.
Right?
Exactly right. That's why the Spirit, part of this, the sign of this functioning new life is that the Spirit is guiding your perception. You're being renewed constantly. It's a process in which the Spirit renews your capacity to perceive so that you see things as they actually are. And it's because you see things as they are that you then live what you do. Once again, I know this is redundant, but we don't have to work ourselves up emotionally to stop at a red light. We just don't need to do that. Why? Because we've already perceived this is what's going to be the smart thing to do. If I run the light and here comes this big 18-wheeler, I think it will hit me. And I may just, right? That's it. So you don't have to work yourself up. You don't have to feel almost anything. Why? Because what you perceived is the truth of the situation, and so you live accordingly. Because when you live according to what is the truth, well then, life seems to go pretty well. There's no death there. This is what it means to have faith. Faith is all wrapped up with your perception of reality. So that when you perceive who Jesus is, when you perceive who the Father is, etc., you say, that's what I'm trusting. I trust that to be true. And so, whether I feel it or not, that's what I'm going to do. Because that's reality. I don't have to feel the red light in order to stop. And if I feel like, oh, I just want to run that red light, I think, there's a little bit of craziness in that. And so I think, no, I'm going to stop anyway. Right? That's my OCD kicking in, not going to be good. So I'm not going to run that light. Even though everything in me wants to run it, I don't do it. Do you see the difference here? This is simply talking about how do human beings function. And we've made it so much about morality and rule breaking that we've missed the whole point. And it's why we continue to live so unfulfilled. So what is the connection between salvation and our human function?
Well, so many of us have come from theological perspectives and an upbringing that looks at salvation from this atonement transactional perspective to deal with our quote-unquote sin nature, which we now understand is problematic on a whole bunch of different levels.
Yes.
Rather than salvation is what animates or what empowers or what enables us to live the life we were intended to live. And that's a completely different thing.
It is. It is. Salvation, there's a saying in the early church that creation is salvation. And it's this recognition that salvation doesn't do something different than what creation was already doing. What was creation doing? Bringing about humanity. What does salvation do? It simply completes that act of establishing life in Jesus. Now, because there is sin, that means part of that is going to include dealing with sin. But the whole issue is that salvation is what brings about true humanity. That's the point. And so salvation is simply God in the act of bringing about human beings. And that's what he was always going to do anyway. Jesus was always the goal. Humanity was always going to be created in him. Always. Adam was not yet what humanity was going to be. That humanity that started in Adam is completed in Jesus. Jesus is the finish of the creation of human beings. That's why he is the true Adam. Right? And so salvation is simply about this course that I am on. It's going to happen. And there is nothing that can stand in the way of this. Sin doesn't have the power to stand in the way of this. And neither does Satan. And you don't have the power to stand in the way of this. Because I'm going to bring about humanity in communion with me as my image and likeness. It's simply going to happen. And so there isn't this disconnect that salvation is this plan B that has to come into effect because when God created everything and it was finished, now we've messed it up and now God has to do something to change. No. No, this is simply God bringing about creation. You see, so creation isn't about getting your sin debt paid. That's not salvation. Salvation is about being brought to be truly human, which is to be in communion with God as his image and likeness. That's what it means to be human. And that's what God was doing in creation all along anyway. And that's your salvation. Do you see the difference in the models? It's stark, isn't it? So finishing up, how does our discussion this morning practically apply to our daily lives?
I think it raises the question of, are we going to participate with God in bringing that about, or are we going to fight him?
Yeah.
Like, what are we gonna do today?
Yes. Every day. Right, Kara? Yeah. Exactly.
That's a good recognition that if we are dissatisfied or unhappy with the situation, that it's wrong. It's a recognition that that's not what we long for.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We're in the wrong boat.
You're in the wrong boat, man. That's right. That's right. And it's really helpful to know that you can't solve a worldly problem, which is a problem that is ruled by death, by a response of death. You can't do it. And as you respond in death to a situation of death, there's no life there for either one of you, right? And so we've got to carry this awareness with us. We've got to cultivate our perception with the Spirit about who Jesus is and who we are, and think about our life in light of who Jesus is until we see our life in light of Jesus. This all fits together. And this is why, too, we simply, and I'll end here, this is why we were talking about in the first message, our salvation then is not something that's simply up here somewhere. Why? Because it includes our bodies. And our bodies are what we say. It includes our physicality, because what are we? We are an embodied spirit. It's what we are. And when we think about the whole purpose, as Irenaeus told us early on, is to be accustomed as a human being to life in communion with God. That doesn't mean some ethereal part of us. It means our humanity, which is partly physical. So you must use your body if you are going to live a truly human life. And it's why things like breathing meditations that use your body in ways that don't necessarily excite your body, but it never was for exciting your body. It was for something that would take place in your spirit, and then your body now is being accustomed to the reality that it is a union with your spirit. This is the purpose of fasting. Fasting isn't showing God just how serious you really are. That's not the point at all. The point of fasting is to accustom your body to live in line with your spirit, and your spirit with your body. Why? Because you're not two boards just nailed together. You are this integration of spirit and physicality. And so we simply cannot get where we want to get without physical practices. It's not going to happen. And the sooner you come to terms with that, the sooner you're going to make the progress that you want to make, which simply is the sooner you're going to live like what you want to live like. You cannot become human in ways that simply don't involve your body. It's not going to happen. Because to be human is to have a body that is accustomed to the spirit. Pretty straightforward. So if you're doing things with your body that don't grow you in likeness to God, it's a wrong use of your body. And it's an act of death, not life. And until you put your body and your spirit together in your own thinking, because they are in reality, you're not going to perceive life as it really is, and you're not going to have the human way of life. This is why we, as he says here, we learn Christ. Any closing comment or question? In just a few moments, we're going to celebrate the Eucharist. And the reason I put in Eucharist, I just want to remind ourselves, we're talking about when we take the Lord's Supper, there's this, it is an act of thanksgiving. You is good, and charis is grace. It's us saying, this was good grace that you've given to us. I recognize the goodness. And in that, what we are also recognizing is that the grace that is so good is that we have been given the life of Christ. And that we perceive that life as it is present to us. How is he present to us right now? Because it's all just about some spiritual thing, right? Just some mental remembering? No. In the same way that God can be present to us, Jesus is present to us, not just can, he is present to us, whether we recognize or not. In the people who are around us, in the same way that he is present to us, in the hackneyed, beautiful sunset, Jesus is present to us in bread and in the juice, because we have a sacramental world. The bread and the juice are not symbols or of Jesus, things that stand in for Jesus because he isn't here. They are ways of encountering Jesus because in this, something of Jesus being made known to us. In the same way that something of Jesus is being made known to us in this wonderful landscape or in the care of this person over here. There is a life. There is a life. Reflect on that for just a bit and then come and take from the bread and the cup.